The problem with seeking happiness is that the very act of seeking it assumes that happiness is somewhere else, something missing, something to be acquired in the future. This assumption creates a subtle but persistent tension in the mind, a feeling that life as it is now is insufficient. One begins to live in a state of perpetual anticipation, believing that fulfillment lies just beyond the present moment. In this way, the pursuit of happiness becomes a form of resistance to reality, a refusal to accept life as it unfolds. The more one tries to grasp happiness, the more elusive it becomes, slipping through the fingers like water because happiness was never meant to be captured in the first place. Happiness, when treated as a goal, turns into a contradiction. Goals belong to the future, but life is always happening now. The moment happiness is postponed, it is removed from the only place where experience actually occurs. One may achieve success, acquire comfort, or fulfill long-held desires, only to discover that satisfaction is fleeting and soon replaced by the urge for something more. This endless cycle reveals a fundamental misunderstanding. Happiness is not a permanent state to be secured, but a byproduct of fully engaging with life. When happiness is chased, it becomes an obstacle rather than a reward, because attention is fixed on what should be rather than what is. The search for happiness often arises from the belief that unpleasant emotions should be avoided. Pain, sadness, fear, and uncertainty are treated as errors, as signs that something has gone wrong. Yet these experiences are not flaws in life, they are essential aspects of it. To reject them is to reject a portion of existence itself. The desire to be happy all the time is in effect a desire to live a life that is incomplete. Just as light cannot exist without shadow, joy cannot exist without contrast. The attempt to eliminate discomfort creates a shallow form of living, where depth is sacrificed for constant reassurance. There is also a peculiar anxiety hidden within the pursuit of happiness. One constantly monitors emotional states, asking whether happiness has arrived, whether it is sufficient, whether it will last. This self-surveillance fragments experience. Instead of being immersed in the moment, attention is divided between living and evaluating life. The mind becomes a commentator rather than a participant. In this way, happiness is never fully tasted because it is always being measured. The irony is that the happiest moments often occur when one is not thinking about happiness at all, when awareness is absorbed in the activity itself. The problem deepens when happiness is treated as a personal achievement. One begins to believe that happiness must be earned through effort, discipline, or self-improvement. While growth and learning have value, turning happiness into a reward reinforces the illusion that the self is incomplete. This creates a perpetual sense of inadequacy, as if one is always falling short of an ideal version of life. The self becomes a project that is never finished, always in need of repair. In this state, even moments of contentment feel fragile, because they depend on maintaining a certain image or condition. Seeking happiness also separates the individual from the natural flow of life. Life is not a straight line moving toward a fixed destination, it is a rhythm, a process, a dance. When one insists on happiness as the final outcome, the richness of the journey is overlooked. Moments that do not align with the desired emotional state are dismissed as distractions or failures. Yet these moments often carry the deepest insights. Confusion, loss, and uncertainty have a way of revealing truths that comfort cannot. To demand happiness at all times is to close the door to these revelations. There is a deeper freedom available when the search for happiness is abandoned. This freedom arises not from acquiring a better emotional state, but from accepting the changing nature of experience. When one stops insisting that life should feel a certain way, a sense of ease emerges naturally. Emotions are allowed to come and go without resistance. Joy is welcomed when it appears, and sorrow is permitted to pass without judgment. In this acceptance, life becomes less of a struggle and more of a participation in something vast and mysterious. Happiness, when it arises naturally, is quiet and unassuming. It does not announce itself or demand attention. It appears in moments of presence, in simple awareness, in being fully engaged with what is happening. It cannot be forced, but it can be allowed. The moment one stops chasing it, happiness has the space to appear on its own terms. This is not a strategy, but a shift in understanding. It is the recognition that life does not need to be improved before it can be lived. The pursuit of happiness often masks a deeper fear, the fear of uncertainty. By seeking a constant emotional state, one tries to secure life against change. Yet change is the very nature of existence. Everything moves, transforms, arises, and fades. To demand permanence from a world defined by impermanence is to create suffering. When this is seen clearly, the compulsion to seek happiness begins to loosen. One realizes that the desire for certainty was never about happiness at all, but about control. When happiness is no longer treated as the purpose of life, life itself becomes the purpose. Each moment is met on its own terms without being compared to an imagined ideal. This does not mean life becomes dull or indifferent. On the contrary, it becomes more vivid. Without the pressure to feel a certain way, experience is felt more deeply. Pleasure is enjoyed without clinging, and difficulty is faced without despair. There is a sense of trust in the unfolding of events, an understanding that meaning is not something to be manufactured, but something that reveals itself through participation. The problem with seeking happiness is not that happiness is undesirable, but that seeking misunderstands its nature. Happiness is not a destination, not a possession, not a permanent condition. It is a momentary expression of being in harmony with the present. When the present is resisted, happiness is resisted as well. When the present is embraced, happiness requires no effort. It appears as a natural resonance between awareness and life, as it is unpredictable, impermanent, and endlessly alive. Seeking happiness assumes that happiness is missing, that something essential has been misplaced, and that life as it is now is somehow incomplete. This assumption quietly shapes the way one relates to experience, creating a subtle sense of deficiency that lingers beneath daily activities. The moment happiness is treated as something to be found, the present moment is judged as inadequate, merely a stepping stone toward a better future. This judgment introduces resistance, a refusal to fully inhabit what is happening now, because attention is fixed on what should be rather than what is. Life becomes a waiting room, and existence is postponed in anticipation of an imagined fulfillment that is always just out of reach. This resistance to the present moment is rarely dramatic. It often appears as mild dissatisfaction, restlessness, or the sense that something more should be happening. One may be surrounded by comfort, opportunity, and stimulation, yet still feel uneasy, because the mind is oriented toward a future state called happiness that has not yet arrived. In this way, seeking happiness subtly undermines contentment. The present is no longer a place to live, but a problem to be solved. Each moment is evaluated based on whether it contributes to happiness, and anything that does not is dismissed, avoided, or endured impatiently. The irony is that happiness is not absent from the present. It is obscured by the belief that it lies elsewhere. When attention is constantly projected forward, awareness is fragmented. Instead of experiencing life directly, one experiences ideas about life. Sensations, emotions, and interactions are filtered through expectation and comparison. The richness of immediate experience is reduced to a checklist of outcomes, and life loses its spontaneity. What remains is a chronic sense of striving, a feeling of being perpetually on the way but never arriving. This assumption of lack also reinforces a distorted sense of self. If happiness is missing, then the self must be deficient. One begins to believe that something is wrong internally, that improvement is required before life can be enjoyed. This belief fuels endless self-correction, self-analysis, and self-optimization. The self becomes a project rather than a presence. Instead of living, one is constantly preparing to live, rehearsing for a future that never becomes now. This creates tension, because the self is always chasing an ideal version of experience rather than participating in the experience itself. Resistance to the present moment is also resistance to change. The desire for happiness often disguises a longing for stability, for an emotional state that can be maintained indefinitely. Yet life does not function this way. Everything moves, shifts, arises, and fades. Emotions are transient, circumstances evolve, and certainty is an illusion. When one seeks happiness as a fixed condition, one is effectively asking life to stop moving. This demand places the individual in conflict with the very nature of existence, producing frustration and disappointment when reality refuses to comply. The assumption that happiness is missing also creates a habit of comparison. The present moment is measured against imagined alternatives, memories of the past, or ideals borrowed from others. One wonders whether life should feel different, whether more joy should be present, whether fulfillment should be constant. This comparison pulls awareness away from what is actually happening and replaces it with mental projections. Instead of engaging with life, one stands apart from it, judging, evaluating, and correcting, never fully entering the experience itself. When resistance becomes habitual, even pleasant moments are compromised. Joy is accompanied by anxiety about its duration, satisfaction by fear of loss. The mind hovers over experience rather than resting within it. This hovering prevents full absorption because attention is divided between the moment and the concern of whether the moment is sufficient. Happiness, when it appears, is scrutinized rather than enjoyed. In this way, the search for happiness becomes self-defeating, not because happiness is impossible, but because it cannot coexist with resistance to what is. When it is seen that the assumption of missing happiness is itself the source of dissatisfaction, a shift begins to occur. The present moment no longer needs to justify itself. Experience is allowed to be what it is, without being measured against an imagined standard. This does not mean that every moment becomes pleasant, but it does mean that every moment becomes available. Resistance softens, awareness deepens, and life is encountered directly rather than through expectation. In this openness, happiness is no longer sought because the sense of lack that drove the search begins to dissolve, revealing that what was believed to be missing was never absent at all. Treating happiness as a goal turns life into constant anticipation and dissatisfaction. The moment happiness is placed in the future, life is postponed. One begins to live for outcomes rather than for experience, measuring each day by how well it contributes to an imagined state of fulfillment. This orientation creates a subtle but persistent tension, because the present moment is never allowed to be complete. It is always seen as a means to an end, a necessary but insufficient step towards something better. In this way, life becomes a corridor leading to a destination that is never quite reached. Goals are useful for practical matters, but happiness does not function like a destination on a map. Happiness occurs, if at all, in moments of presence, not in projections of what might be. When happiness is treated as a goal, attention shifts away from what is happening now and toward what should happen later. The mind becomes preoccupied with planning, adjusting, and evaluating, while the richness of immediate experience fades into the background. Even moments that could be fulfilling lose their depth because they are valued only for their usefulness in achieving something else. This constant anticipation creates dissatisfaction even in success. When a desired outcome is achieved, the satisfaction is brief because the habit of looking ahead remains. The mind quickly identifies a new goal, a new condition that must be met before happiness can return. In this way, happiness becomes conditional, dependent on circumstances aligning in a particular way. Life is reduced to a series of checkpoints, each promising fulfillment but delivering only temporary relief. The individual becomes skilled at achieving but remains unfamiliar with simply being. Anticipation also distorts the perception of time. The present feels rushed, incomplete, or burdensome, while the future is idealized. This creates a sense of impatience, a feeling that life is always on hold. One is never fully at ease because ease has been scheduled for later. The paradox is that when the future arrives, it becomes another present moment, subject to the same dissatisfaction. The structure of anticipation ensures that fulfillment is always deferred. Treating happiness as a goal also encourages comparison. One begins to evaluate progress, to measure life against expectations and against the perceived success of others. This comparison intensifies dissatisfaction because it reinforces the belief that happiness is something to be achieved rather than something to be allowed. The more one compares, the more inadequate the present feels, and the more urgently one seeks improvement. Life becomes a competition rather than a participation. There is also a subtle violence in goal-oriented happiness. It imposes a demand on experience to produce a particular feeling. When experience does not comply, it is judged as failure. Emotions such as boredom, sadness, or uncertainty are treated as obstacles rather than as natural aspects of being alive. This rejection fragments experience and creates inner conflict. Instead of flowing with life, one is constantly correcting it, attempting to bend it toward an imagined ideal. When happiness is no longer treated as a goal, anticipation loses its grip. The present is no longer a means to an end, but an end in itself. Experience regains its depth because it is no longer being evaluated for usefulness. Action still occurs, goals may still be pursued, but they are no longer burdened with the impossible task of delivering permanent fulfillment. Life is lived directly rather than postponed, and dissatisfaction begins to soften as the pressure to arrive somewhere else gradually falls away. Avoiding discomfort leads to a shallow and incomplete experience of life. The desire to be happy often hides a deeper refusal to feel what is uncomfortable, uncertain, or painful. When unpleasant emotions arise, there is a tendency to treat them as mistakes, as signs that something has gone wrong and must be corrected immediately. This attitude creates a narrow range of acceptable experience, where only certain feelings are permitted and the rest are pushed away. Life, however, does not conform to these preferences. It includes tension, loss, confusion, and vulnerability as naturally as it includes pleasure and ease. When discomfort is avoided, experience becomes fragmented. Certain emotions are welcomed, while others are denied, creating an artificial division within the self. This division requires constant effort to maintain. One must remain vigilant, suppressing what feels threatening and amplifying what feels pleasant. In doing so, awareness becomes restricted, and the full texture of life is never fully encountered. What remains is a curated version of existence, polished and controlled, but lacking depth and authenticity. Discomfort has a way of revealing truths that comfort cannot. Moments of uncertainty expose the limits of control, while moments of loss illuminate the impermanence of all things. These experiences, though difficult, deepen understanding and expand perception. To avoid them is to avoid growth. When life is filtered to exclude what is unpleasant, it also loses its capacity to surprise, to teach, and to transform. The richness of existence lies not in constant pleasure, but in the contrast between ease and difficulty, clarity and confusion. The effort to avoid discomfort also creates fear. When certain feelings are labeled unacceptable, their mere possibility becomes threatening. One begins to organize life around preventing their appearance, making choices based not on curiosity or engagement, but on avoidance. This shrinks the field of experience and reinforces a sense of fragility. The individual becomes cautious, defensive, and inwardly tense even in moments that appear calm on the surface. Paradoxically, the attempt to avoid discomfort often amplifies it. Suppressed emotions do not disappear, they linger beneath awareness, influencing thoughts, reactions, and behaviors. What is resisted persists, returning in subtle forms such as anxiety, restlessness, or dissatisfaction. The more one tries to escape discomfort, the more pervasive it becomes. In contrast, when discomfort is allowed, it moves naturally, arising and passing like any other experience. A life that permits discomfort is not a miserable life, but a complete one. It allows for genuine joy, because joy is no longer demanded or clung to. Pleasure is appreciated without fear of its absence, and difficulty is faced without panic. Experience becomes fluid rather than rigid, responsive rather than defensive. By allowing discomfort, one enters into a more honest relationship with life, one that honors the full range of experience rather than insisting on a narrow definition of happiness, and in this openness, life regains its depth, its vitality, and its capacity to be truly lived. Chasing happiness increases self-monitoring and weakens genuine presence. When happiness becomes an objective, attention turns inward in a restless and fragmented way. Instead of being immersed in experience, the mind begins to watch itself, checking emotional states, evaluating satisfaction, and measuring whether the moment is delivering the desired feeling. This constant monitoring divides awareness. One part of the mind attempts to live, while another stands aside to judge how well life is being lived. The result is a thinning of experience, where moments are never fully entered because they are continually being assessed. This habit of self-observation creates distance between awareness and life. Experience becomes something to manage rather than something to participate in. Even pleasant moments lose their immediacy because attention is split between enjoying them and ensuring they last. There is an underlying anxiety that happiness might slip away, and this anxiety prevents full relaxation into the moment. The very act of checking whether one is happy interrupts the conditions that allow happiness to arise naturally. Self-monitoring also reinforces the sense of a separate self that must be maintained and improved. The individual becomes both performer and audience, actor and critic. Every emotion is scrutinized, every reaction interpreted as evidence of progress or failure. This internal commentary creates noise that obscures direct perception. Instead of hearing the sound itself, one hears thoughts about the sound. Instead of feeling the moment, one evaluates the feeling. Presence is replaced by analysis, and life becomes conceptual rather than lived. As self-monitoring intensifies, spontaneity diminishes. There is less room for surprise, playfulness, or immersion. Because attention is preoccupied with outcomes, actions are chosen not for their inherent interest, but for their perceived ability to produce happiness. This instrumental approach drains vitality from experience. Activities become tasks, relationships become strategies, and emotions become indicators rather than expressions of life. The natural flow of engagement is replaced by effortful management. The weakening of presence also affects connection. Genuine presence is the foundation of meaningful interaction, yet self-monitoring pulls attention away from what is unfolding. Instead of listening fully, one listens while simultaneously evaluating emotional responses. Instead of engaging openly, one remains guarded, tracking internal states. This division reduces intimacy and depth because presence cannot be partial. It requires full attention, unburdened by constant assessment. When the pursuit of happiness relaxes, self-monitoring loses its urgency. Awareness settles into experience rather than hovering above it. Emotions are felt directly, without being labeled as successes or failures. The mind becomes quieter, not through effort, but through the absence of unnecessary interference. Presence returns naturally when there is nothing to measure, nothing to improve, and nothing to secure, allowing experience to unfold in its own rhythm, rich with immediacy and unforced engagement. Happiness arises naturally when life is accepted rather than controlled. Much of the struggle associated with seeking happiness comes from the assumption that experience must be shaped, corrected, or improved before it can be enjoyed. This assumption places the individual in opposition to life, as though existence were a problem to be solved rather than a process to be lived. Control becomes the primary strategy, and happiness is treated as the reward for successful management. Yet life resists such management, moving according to rhythms that cannot be forced or predicted. Acceptance is often misunderstood as passivity, but it is in fact a deep form of engagement. To accept life is not to withdraw from it, but to meet it without resistance. When experience is allowed to unfold without being judged against an ideal, awareness relaxes. Emotions are no longer enemies to be subdued or trophies to be collected. They become movements within a larger flow, arising and passing without threatening the integrity of the self. In this relaxed awareness, happiness appears not as an achievement, but as a byproduct of being fully present. Control narrows experience by insisting on particular outcomes. When life does not comply, frustration arises. Acceptance, on the other hand, widens experience. It allows for a full range of emotions, sensations, and events without privileging some and rejecting others. This inclusiveness creates a sense of ease, not because everything becomes pleasant, but because nothing needs to be resisted. The absence of resistance frees energy that was previously spent on struggle, and this energy expresses itself as clarity, attentiveness, and quiet joy. There is also a subtle trust embedded in acceptance. To accept life as it is implies confidence in the process of existence, even when its direction is unclear. This trust does not require certainty. It rests on the understanding that life does not need constant supervision to unfold meaningfully. When control is relaxed, one participates more fully in the present moment, responding rather than reacting, listening rather than anticipating. Action still occurs, but it arises from responsiveness rather than compulsion. Happiness that arises through acceptance is different from the happiness that is sought. It is less dramatic, less dependent on circumstances, and more resilient. It does not demand permanence or protection. It coexists with difficulty without being extinguished by it. Because it is not clung to, it does not produce fear of loss. It moves naturally with the changing conditions of life, appearing and disappearing without leaving behind a sense of deprivation. When life is accepted rather than controlled, experience regains its fluidity. Moments are met as they are, without being compared to what should have been. The present no longer serves as a means to an end, but as a living reality in itself. In this openness, happiness emerges quietly, not as a goal fulfilled, but as the natural resonance between awareness and life unfolding just as it is. When all of this is seen together, it becomes clear that the search for happiness was never the solution to dissatisfaction, but one of its most subtle causes. By turning happiness into an object to be obtained, life was divided into what is happening now and what should happen later. This division created tension, restlessness, and the feeling of being perpetually unfinished. The moment life is approached as something that must deliver a particular emotional result, experience is burdened with expectation, and the natural ease of being is disturbed. What becomes evident is that happiness cannot be separated from the way life is approached. It does not exist as an independent condition waiting to be discovered, but arises from the quality of attention brought to experience. When attention is fragmented by resistance, anticipation, and control, happiness has no space to appear. When attention is simple, open, and present, happiness requires no effort. It emerges quietly, not as an achievement, but as a natural harmony between awareness and the unfolding moment. This understanding does not promise a life free from difficulty. It does not suggest that confusion, pain, or uncertainty will disappear. Instead, it reveals that these experiences were never obstacles to living well. They were misunderstood as problems only because life was measured against an imagined ideal. When that measurement falls away, experience is allowed to be whole. Joy is no longer demanded, sorrow is no longer rejected, and the richness of existence reveals itself through contrast rather than perfection. There is a profound relief in realizing that nothing needs to be fixed before life can be lived. The effort to improve oneself into happiness gradually loosens its grip, and the constant inner commentary begins to quiet. What remains is a sense of participation rather than struggle, of movement rather than resistance. Life is no longer something to conquer or escape, but something to enter fully moment by moment, without guarantees and without conditions. In letting go of the pursuit of happiness, one does not become indifferent or detached from life. On the contrary, engagement deepens. Experiences are felt more directly because they are no longer filtered through the question of whether they are sufficient. Presence becomes natural rather than forced. Awareness settles into what is happening instead of hovering above it. In this settling, the simplicity of being reveals a depth that seeking could never provide. The paradox, then, is simple but profound. Happiness appears when it is no longer required. Fulfillment arises when it is no longer demanded. Life opens when it is no longer resisted. This is not a method to be practiced or a philosophy to be adopted, but a recognition to be noticed. The moment this is seen, even briefly, the struggle softens and experience regains its natural rhythm, flowing freely, unpredictably, and vividly, just as life has always done when allowed to be itself.